Thank you all for joining the Agrisolar Clearinghouse webinar on policy. We recently released 2 publications, one on the existing agrisolar policies in the United States and one on policy approaches for dual use and agrisolar practices. The authors of those reports are here with us today to talk about their work. Alexis Pascaris, Allison Jackson, and Heidi Kolbeck-Urlacher are here with us today, and they are going to talk about each of these publications. Heidi is a funded partner of the Agrisolar Clearinghouse, and Alexis and Allison are contractors of the Agrisolar Clearinghouse. I'd also like to acknowledge Byron Komanek of Jack's Solar Garden and the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center for their work on the Agrisolar Policy Guide. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the work of the Agrisolar Clearinghouse team. There's a lot of work that goes into these. And I would like to thank the Department of Energy for their review, for their guidance, and for their funding of this work. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the speakers now. If you have any questions, please drop them into the chat. The speakers have provided their contact information on the last slide of this presentation, and you can always contact us with questions or for technical assistance at agrisolar@ncat.org. We will drop the links to each of their organizations into the chat, and we'll also drop the links to the publications into the chat. Be free to ask questions as we go. We're going to have a 10-minute question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Heidi Kolbeck-Urlacher is the policy manager at the Center for Rural Affairs, where she oversees their clean energy portfolio. The Center for Rural Affairs is a private nonprofit organization that advocates for policies that strengthen rural communities in order to create a more vibrant future. The center has a focus on assisting rural citizens and community leaders in ensuring clean energy is built in a way that works best for their communities. This includes maintaining a clean energy siting library, which can be found along with other resources on their website. As an Agrisolar Clearinghouse partner, Heidi authored the recently released Policy Approaches, Dual Use, and Agrisolar Practices publication, which she's here to talk about today. Alexis Pascaris is a social scientist and policy specialist. She serves as a stakeholder and as a contractor on the Agrisolar Clearinghouse. She is the founder and the CEO of Agrisolar Consulting. It's an impact-focused consultancy that is on a mission to operationalize agrivoltaics through research, advocacy, stakeholder management, 3D modeling, and more. Allison Jackson is the education director at the Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. The Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center encourages sustainability leadership by connecting students, community members, and policymakers to clean energy, local food, and responsible land use through agrivoltaic tours and events at Jack's Solar Garden. Welcome, ladies. I'm going to hand this off now to Heidi to begin this presentation. And like I say, just drop your questions into the chat.
Thank you, Stacy. So again, I'm Heidi from the Center for Rural Affairs, and I'm going to be kicking off our webinar by giving an overview of what we'll be covering today. So Stacy, if you want to move the slides along.
One second.
Well, I can keep us going while you're working on that. So the purpose of the webinar today is to provide an overview of policy approaches to dual use solar. And by that, we specifically mean combining solar with agricultural practices. And that will also include some conversation around considerations on how regulations can facilitate dual use. So first, we'll be looking at land use and solar and examining the impact that is expected by the rapid increase of solar development in the near future. And then we'll be talking a little bit about the types of dual use solar projects before moving into the bulk of our presentation, which is an overview of the policy mechanisms at the federal, state, and local levels that can facilitate dual use. So, and then lastly, we'll be just taking a look at the impact of local governments on solar development and offer some considerations for those decision makers who are interested in creating ordinances or incentives around dual use. All right, so we can head forward to that next slide. So there is a large expectation of an increase in solar development in the near future. According to the Solar Futures study, by 2050, ground-based solar may require up to 0.5% of land in the contiguous US. However, it is estimated that this requirement could be met by using less than 10% of already disturbed or contaminated lands. By county, it does not appear that current or planned solar projects would require a significant allocation of land as a proportion of local area. In an analysis by the Great Plains Institute, they found that existing solar development comprised only 0.04% of land per county, and that if all of the solar projects that were proposed were built, development would average about 0.22% of land per county. In relation to farmland, clean energy development also does not appear to pose an immediate threat to the availability of farmland. For example, in Iowa, there's about 30.6 million acres of farmland, about 17.5 of which is designated as prime by the USDA. And that if all of the proposed projects in Iowa were built and sited directly on prime farmland, which is not proposed, but even if they were, it would require only 0.11% of prime farmland in the state. Next slide. So because of this allocation for land for solar developments, we are seeing some land use restrictions being put forward by state and local governments. And this can include enacting restrictions on development on prime farmland, or using corn suitability ratings to also use restrictions. So saying that if a land has a high corn suitability rating, that's something that the state of Iowa uses, that they would restrict development in that area. Next slide. Some alternatives to those restrictions are what we're here to talk about today. So that would include taking a more nuanced approach to development that could be developing some state-specific best practices, using model ordinance language that can help inform local governments on how to put together ordinances that allow kind of agriculture and solar to exist together, or using voluntary siting matrices or siting guidance that is a tool for local governments to be able to evaluate a project and still be able to make decisions on their own. One set of principles that takes a more nuanced approach to development is the American Farmland Trust Smart Solar Principles. These principles were developed by the American Farmland Trust to meet 3 goals: accelerate solar energy development, strengthen farm viability, and safeguard land well suited for farming and ranching. So those principles include prioritizing siting on buildings and land not well suited for farmland, safeguarding the ability for land to be used for agriculture, but if land is developed through solar on farmland, then there should be policies and practices in place that protect soil health, especially during construction and decommissioning. And then the utilization of agrivoltaics, which can help keep that land in agricultural production, which we're going to talk a lot more about today. And then ensuring that equity and farm viability are promoted by including farmers and underserved communities in the benefits of any sort of development that happens, and also, very importantly, in the stakeholder engagement process while that development is happening. So this that kind of guidance offers kind of a nuanced approach that shows that there doesn't need to be an either-or mindset towards agriculture versus solar. So this is where dual use comes in. Dual use agrivoltaics, or kind of co-locating agriculture and solar on the same land space, provides an opportunity to address some of these land concerns. So these practices offer both economic and environmental benefits, such as streams of income for local farmers, and then some of those environmental benefits such as increased pollinators, wildlife habitat, decreased erosion, and enhanced soil health. So the types that we're going to highlight today related to crops, growing agricultural crops such as fruit, berries, vegetables, and others, using solar grazing at the site to manage vegetation, beekeeping, and then using pollinator-friendly practices or native vegetation at the site. So this gets us to kind of the meat of our presentation, which is the policy approaches to dual use in agrivoltaics. So federal, state, and local levels of government can influence the implementation or facilitation of dual use solar. And these policies do interact, but overall, local land use policies have been shown to be the most significant indicator of agri-solar development. And so we'll have a specific section to deal with those local ordinances. All right, so because land use decisions are typically made at a local level, federal policy is kind of limited in encouraging or discouraging dual use. However, there are some incentives that are available. So the ITC is the sole corporate tax credit available for solar. It doesn't include any restrictions that would disallow solar on specific locations, which would make it an acceptable combination for incorporating agriculture at the site. As I mentioned, authority over land use in the US is held by state and local governments, so not really an area for policy there, a large area. Portfolio standards. Currently, there is not a federal renewable portfolio standard. It has been proposed, but no such policy exists. Some other programs, though, that are in place that can help encourage renewable development is the Renewable Energy for America program, or REAP, which allows small businesses and farmers to apply for programs such as putting up solar on their farm. And then there's also federal investments in research, such as the Foundational Agrivoltaic Research for Megawatt Scale Farms program, or the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. And I believe there was about $8 million in the farms program and $8 million recently allocated for agrivoltaic research in the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities as well. So state level policies interact with local decision making in ways that can either enable or restrict local governments from enacting certain practices or policies. So this could include land use taxes. For example, the state of Rhode Island amended its farm, forest, and open space land law, exempting landowners from a land use change if they integrate dual use renewable energy system into their property. And then in 2021, New Jersey enacted a dual use solar law, which provides an incentive for keeping land at solar sites and agricultural production. And this also established a pilot program for allowing unpreserved land used for dual use solar projects to be eligible for a farmland assessment with certain conditions in place. Another area would be land use laws, particularly looking at the definitions within that. The definitions of farmland, of farming, of solar, do they preclude agri-solar in any way or dual use? And then also developing state-specific best practices. Right now we know that there are some states that have developed some statewide siting standards that regulate clean energy development, such as the recently passed law in Illinois this year. However, there are also those voluntary approaches, such as the creation of the best practices, model ordinances, voluntary siting that allow for preservation of local control over that. Within portfolio standards, this is where we see this most commonly would be at the state level. There are 31 states that have renewable portfolio standards or clean energy goals. 21 of those have specific solar carve-out provisions that incentivize that piece, and some of those also have a specific standard for agri-solar, such as the state of Massachusetts. Massachusetts also has the SMART program, which is the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target. I think I got it. Which allows for agricultural solar tariff generation units to qualify for financial incentives and receive an incentive on the rate, basically, for production at those solar arrays. So it's an additional 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Another policy within that would be pollinator scorecards or habitat-friendly designations. which can be developed both at the state level as well as the local level to give some reward basically for meeting specific sets of guidance set by an agency or local government that require specific pollinator standards to be met. And so these are something we are seeing kind of at various different levels across the US as well. And then lastly, we have the local land use policy, which is considered the key leverage point because local governments have the most influence over land use, including developing siting ordinances and regulating zoning. So as far as tax incentives, these can be developed at the local level. However, it's more commonly a state policy lever. Land use laws are the primary lever, as we mentioned, for local governments to facilitate dual use through their zoning ordinances and land codes. Within that, we also have comprehensive planning, which can help guide how development happens in an area. And so those land use issues we're going to get into a little bit later. Currently, we know that many states and local governments have no solar ordinances. For example, as of 2020, only 19% of townships in Michigan addressed any sort of utility scale solar siting. And we also see a low level of that in a recently released report from the Agrisolar Clearinghouse related to Illinois. Portfolio standards, this is something that could be incorporated at a local municipality or a local utility of setting renewable energy goals. Then we also have community agri-solar projects, which allow the community to buy in to those projects and have a greater sense of ownership as well. And so I'm going to turn it over to my co-host here, Alexis, and she is going to take a deeper dive on some of these state level initiatives.
Great. Can you all hear me? Thanks, Heidi. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, everyone, for including me in this conversation. It's really an honor to be here. So as introduced, my name is Alexis Pascaris, and I'm the founder of Agrisolar Consulting. So I help solar developers, farmers, scientists, and regulators make agrivoltaics happen. And I do that through research, advocacy, stakeholder management, 3D modeling, and more. So I'm a social scientist by discipline. And I spent the majority of my professional career trying to understand the diffusion of agrivoltaics from a socio-political perspective. And right now, my work at Agrisolar Consulting involves managing agrivoltaic R&D projects. And one of those projects is the Agrisolar Clearinghouse, which is super near and dear to me. So I help the Clearinghouse develop informational resources, field trips, podcasts, all the fun stuff, our peer mentoring program as well. And I want to really focus on our newest informational resource, which is this Agrisolar Policy Guide. It was just published yesterday. So my contribution to the conversation right now is a focus on state level policy initiatives. Heidi gave a nice overview, but I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper. So I just want to start by introducing the purpose of the policy guide and how we developed it, and then I'll dive in to cover each state that are included. So at a high level, the tool was designed to facilitate policy learning and innovation in the US. So we created this resource as like a central policy platform, which helps create engagement and stimulate really good learning on these important topics, just like we're doing right now here together. And I want to be really clear that this resource is intended to showcase the state of the art in agrisolar policy. So it's not meant for advocacy of certain initiatives. We're impartial towards policy at the Clearinghouse, but we simply wanted to collate existing initiatives, what's out there, what are their key provisions. So we distilled all of those big, complex regulatory documents and made the concepts accessible for public use. So that's it. No advocacy, just the state of the art. So what I did, I went out of the world and purposefully selected state level policy initiatives that would showcase the full suite of regulatory strategies. So I wanted all types of agrisolar to be represented. So crops, grazing, pollinator habitat, as well as different types of policy approaches. So market mechanisms, scoring systems, mandates, voluntary programs, what is out there? I want to showcase all of it. And the result of that sampling method is 5 state initiatives, and that's as of March 2023. So we intend to regularly update the guide. So we definitely welcome your feedback on what should be included or opportunities for improvement. And I will say that what is included is not exhaustive. I'm aware of other state programs that are under development, and many local initiatives that Heidi and Allison will speak to further. So let's explore the guide. Stacey, if you can go a little bit further. So what I've included are the 5 policy initiatives in Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. And this guide is a simplification of really rich data. It's meant to be short and succinct. So what you'll see as you explore the guide are abbreviated policy provisions. The unabridged, the big, thick regulatory documents are provided in our resources section. So what I'm showing here on this screen is the legend. So this legend outlines what terms were used to organize the data. So what's included? We've got the stated goals. These are the goals that govern policy development, very abstract and high level. And all of these are the verbatim language from source documents. So as you go through the guide, anything that's indicated by anything that's included in quotation indicates that it's verbatim from the policy document. And we've got objectives. This is the program level operationalization. So what does the policy formally aim to achieve? We got the settings, and this is typically what people really care about, the specific on the ground requirements. We got implementation. So what government agency developed and administers the program? What mechanism are they using? What's the policy instrument? And then we've got monitoring. Who's monitoring? Who has the authority, and what's the process? And then we've got other things like how they define agrisolar or agrivoltaics, any other noteworthy provisions, and all relevant links that are meaningful to each state. So this is the approach, and I'm going to give a really quick overview of each state. So I'm just going to flag key points. I'll really inspire you to do this on your own time, and then I'll get out of the way so we can hear from Allison and Heidi again. Okay, so we've got the Illinois program. This was developed by the Illinois Power Agency and launched in the fall of 2022, so it's relatively fresh. They created a scoring system, and that prioritizes qualitative aspects of projects, which means they're placing value on key qualitative objectives. So that includes agrivoltaics. So this value takes form in the rewarding of points or credit to developers. In order to win points, which then would elevate your project in the Illinois Community Solar Block, you have to submit an agrivoltaic development plan. And this plan includes justification for the agricultural use, your system design, really robust decommissioning plans, and a lot more. So there's a lot to it. Check it out after the webinar. But we'll move on to Massachusetts here. Heidi spoke to it at a high level. I'll go a little bit deeper because I think this is probably the most well-known for being the pioneer program in the US. So program in Massachusetts was launched in 2018. It was developed by the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources in consultation with the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. Actually, UMass Clean Energy Extension and UMass Ag Extension also play a role in administration. Specifically, they review applications that are submitted by developers. So how are they making it happen? Well, they're using a market mechanism, a feed-in tariff, to incentivize developers. So developers who innovate and qualify for the adder are rewarded a compensation rate of 6 cents per kilowatt hour of agrivoltaics. And from what I hear, that is a nice incentive. It makes projects pencil and be economically viable. So the developer has to work in partnership with the farmer. They have to create an agricultural plan, and they have to adhere to specific system design parameters as well. And there's also annual reporting and lots more. And this is the only bona fide agrivoltaic policy program that leverages a tariff. So we have a lot to learn from the experience of developers and other regulators who are engaging with the program. I think it's a great case study for future policy development. So we'll go down to Michigan. So here we're pivoting. We're going to look at a program that's discretely focused on pollinator habitat. So the past two were focused on crops and livestock, but this is pollinator habitat specifically. So in 2019, Governor Whitmer and the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development established conditions under which a solar system could be developed on farmland. Farmland specifically that's enrolled in the Farmland Development Rights Program. So this initiative is concerned with preserved farmland and how to manage what they're calling competing good land uses. So they don't really provide a definition for agrivoltaics or agrisolar. They simply focus on pollinator habitat standards for solar on preserved farmland. And what they're doing is they're mandating the development and maintenance of pollinator habitat. So to obtain the right to develop, solar companies have to achieve a score of at least 76 on a pollinator habitat planning scorecard. And that scorecard was developed by Michigan State University Extension and the Department of Entomology. So this program is pretty simple. Developers have to design and maintain pollinator habitat. And farmers who are engaging in the solar lease cannot claim tax credits during the lifetime of the system. Either these parties adhere to those provisions or solar cannot be sited on preserved farmland. It's pretty simple. So we'll transition now because we're still in the spirit of pollinator habitat. Let's look at Minnesota. So we've got the Minnesota Habitat Friendly Solar Program. It's super robust. The amount of pollinator friendly solar projects in Minnesota is pretty much good proof of the program's impact. And I think this is part of the reason why the Agrisolar Clearinghouse featured them in the Follow the Sun tour. So if you want to see all these beautiful sites, you can check out our media hub. So the program was developed, it was the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in partnership with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. And this is a voluntary program. So unlike the Michigan mandate, the program simply encourages site management practices that provide native pollinator habitat. But why would someone volunteer to do that? Well, voluntary environmental programs reward leadership and they recognize innovation. So solar developers who want to claim that they are leaders and that their site provides benefits to pollinators and birds and local communities and ecosystem services, all the good stuff, they would engage with this program. There's a lot that goes into qualifying. There's project planning assessment, continuous monitoring and reporting. And again, this is voluntary, but at the end of the day, those developers interested in land stewardship and leadership will gain recognition under this program. So you essentially get a gold sticker that speaks volumes in the marketplace. And I'm breezing through, we'll finish up with New York here. So NYSERDA, I kept New York for last because it's all encompassing. It includes crops, livestock, and pollinator habitat in the program. So this program was developed by NYSERDA, and their goal is to minimize the impacts of solar on agricultural and environmental resources. And they're aiming to achieve this by encouraging dual use or agrivoltaics. So what they're doing is incentivizing innovation through a bid preference. A bid preference means that a project is evaluated more favorably during the RFP process. So you can earn more points by meeting objectives, and those points elevate your proposal. So it's not a direct monetary incentive like in Massachusetts, but a bid preference does have a tangible benefit. So developers have to complete and submit NYSERDA's Smart Solar Siting Scorecard. The scorecard has a flow chart that you work through, you tally up your points. It makes sure that you're adhering to key strategies and objectives. And the more robust your project, the more points you get, the better chance you have winning the RFP. Okay, I think that's where I'm going to pause. I really hope you find this useful. Again, for the sake of time, I really didn't do the guide justice in terms of the level of detail it provides. So please check it out. I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I will step back and let's hear from Allison about local level initiatives. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexis, for the state level policy guide. And I'm going to focus mostly on local policy across it, so county level. But I did want to talk a little bit about Colorado and their state level. So can you pull up a little bit more for me? So a bill just got introduced and it's now been passed out of committee, which is great. It's been amended a little bit and added a little bit more detail on it. So this should be passed this summer because it is a bipartisan bill. And then there should be some text that pops up, Stacy. Sorry. So summary of it, basically, we're creating a stakeholder task force so that we can study potential barriers and how we can enhance agrivoltaics in the state of Colorado. So these stakeholders are going to be a lot of the Colorado State Department of Agriculture, the Colorado Energy Office, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, hopefully the Public Utilities Commission. All these people are going to come together and come up with a report for it. It also amended the definition of agrivoltaics to add in things for improved pollinator habitat and cover cropping. It also is including a tax incentive. So this is great that we're going to provide a personal property tax incentive for equipment if you are creating an agrivoltaic or a novel design. So this includes things like lifting the panels higher, other things that are pollinator friendly, construction, all sorts of different things. They are also creating a grant program for agrivoltaic projects funding is to be determined. There might not be any funding this year, unfortunately, but hopefully in the future, we'll have a lot of grant program or grants that will go out to producers. So like I said, I focused mostly on local level or county level. Sorry, too far. So why do we think this is important? As Heidi said earlier, almost every project is approved on that local level. So they're who gets to say where and when and how these projects are actually done. So we're seeing a shift in this for some states. So Illinois and California have decided that they're going to push the control up to the state level. And so those counties have lost their local government control. I found that there's a couple other states that are considering doing this in Indiana and Michigan, but it varies completely, very widely in terms of how much regulation there is. Some have very comprehensive regulation in terms of what you can do and where, and then other counties have zero mention of solar or renewable energy at all in their regulations. So how did we approach this? So first, we started close to home. We wanted to start with Colorado. So we looked at the county where Jack's Solar Garden is actually located, which is Boulder County. And then we looked at the county that was directly adjacent to us, which is Weld County, and we'll take a look at those in a second. From there, we wanted to get a view of across the whole country. So we picked 2 counties. So we wanted it to not just be one single representative, but have 2 counties in each state. So we picked one for the Northeast region, which was going to be New York. For the Midwest region, we picked Illinois counties. We picked 2 counties in Louisiana to represent the Southeast. Colorado, like I said, for the Mountain West. And then we also looked at 2 counties in California to represent Pacific. So it did 10 counties in total. So we looked at a lot of different things. And so this is where I don't want to get too much into the nitty gritty, but I would direct you to look at the local policy guide that we just published yesterday. So we looked at the size. So how much acreage could you do? And also how much site coverage you were allowed to do for your specific parcel. We also looked at the zoning designation. So is it allowed in residential versus agriculture versus industrial versus commercial? And then because this is an agrisolar guide, we were looking specifically at how solar interacted with the agricultural lands. And then the permitting and the application requirements, those showed you basically how involved it was to get your project approved and how many reports and different things you had to provide to the county. The next one, so height restrictions, setbacks, fencing, and vegetative barrier, those all had to do with changes in landscape and viewshed. So some counties are more sensitive to changes in landscape or viewshed. And so you can kind of get a gauge of that by looking at all of those different aspects. Things like noise and glare, those ones were kind of interesting to look at. Mostly these aren't very much of a problem for solar sites. So just interesting to see what some counties included in their restrictions. And then finally, looking at dust and vegetative management. Those tell you a lot about what construction practices are going to be prioritized in those counties. So, you know, how quickly do you have to have it revegetated and what kind of seed mixes can you use? So construction practices are really important to continue ongoing agriculture. So anything that can reduce compaction or keep the ground covered is a good thing for that. Finally, the last 2 are decommissioning plans or bonds. So these can be pretty involved. This involves if you're at the end of the lifespan of your solar facility, you have to have a plan to get that removed and taken out of the ground, or if your system stops working, you have to have some sort of plan. Some of these had lots of requirements and lots of mandates. Other times it was just a few sentences. And then the last thing is the decommissioning bond. So this is, you have to prove that you have the assets basically to take it out of the ground at that point. So this can cost projects quite a bit of money. And so it's interesting to see how strict those requirements were for the decommissioning bonds in some areas. So just really quickly, I don't have time to go through all 10, but I just wanted to look at the Colorado ones and we can see some of the differences that pop out quickly. So one thing I want to show is the size of the projects. In Boulder County, you're not allowed to be larger than 14 acres. And that's a relatively small project. Whereas in Weld County, they'll let you go all the way up to 320 acres. So that's a big difference. Other things, so setbacks, Boulder County didn't really care as much because it was only 100 feet, whereas Weld County required over 500 feet, especially if you're close to residential. If you're looking at the screening, so if you only were required to screen your array if it gets higher than 15 feet in Boulder County, and again in Weld County only if you were close to a residential property, would you have to provide, trees and other vegetation that would not affect the view shed of other people. And the last thing is decommissioning. So both of them had decommissioning plans. However, Boulder County did not have a decommissioning bond, and that really was helpful for our solar project to get developed, was not having to have that money set aside. And so then I just wanted to talk about the dual use allowances that we saw. We were able to see a couple places, so only really 2 of the counties. So New York, Montgomery, New York had 2 things for dual use. They allowed you to increase the size of your project from 20 acres to 40 acres if you had a dual use project in mind. And you were also allowed to increase the lot coverage from 40% up to 75%. So that gives you more area for your project. Another county, so St. Louis Obispo in California, created an easier permitting process. So it was a conditional use permit instead of a minor or major use permit. And then it didn't require an open space easement if you had dual use in mind. So what they included, like I said, but not completely limited to, is you need to make sure that you don't disturb the soils when you're installing your solar energy facility, and you eliminated concrete bases. You can install these without that and still have it be sturdy. And then also the mounting the panels off the ground so that you can continue with agricultural uses. So those were the only allowances really for dual use that we saw in the 10 counties that we did. And so we'd like to see more of that if possible. Let's go to the next one. So what's next? We only have 3,000 counties to go in the country. So just kidding. We are looking at Colorado. We're partnering with the National Renewable Energy Lab and NCAT to look at all 64 counties in Colorado. We now have about 10 of them done, I think. And then University of Illinois put out a really good local solar policy guide in Illinois as well. So not quite 3,000 left, but we would encourage any other people to take a look at policies in their own state, because that is how things will be incentivized or approved. Last thing is, so Colorado Agrivoltaic Learning Center. So we're located at Jack Solar Garden in Longmont, Illinois. And so we have 3 educational pillars. We like to engage students. So that's primarily my job, is working with high school students and bringing them to the farm and engaging them in agrivoltaic activities and tours. Finally, we have we have public tours every Saturday, starting this weekend and going throughout the whole growing season. So if you're in Colorado, come out and visit us. And then finally, we like to provide education to policymakers on the local level, but also at state level. Policymakers can't be experts on everything. And so we just like to provide some of that technical assistance with educating them. And that's all I have. So let's get back to, I think, Heidi.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to offer some consideration for local decision makers at this point to discuss a little bit about kind of some ideas about how ordinances can help facilitate dual use. And so we're going to first talk a little bit about land use planning. So within county government, there's generally a comprehensive land use plan. And this reflects the values and visions of that community and how they see progress moving forward, development happening, those sort of things. And this can be a way for language to inform ordinances. And if the language is vague within this county comprehensive land use plan, it can be difficult to interpret. How does that apply to dual use? So a lot of land use planning might include language relating to the preservation of agricultural heritage, preserving agricultural heritage, preserving farmland. And so what our county has to do with deciding how their ordinances should be written in a way around solar development and dual use. So definitely thinking a little bit about how does agrivoltaics and dual use fit into the comprehensive land use plan? How does that fit into the goal of having agriculture preserved in a changing county? Can help alleviate some of that and provide, again, some nuance to that either or mindset about agriculture and clean energy development. We know that this is happening in our work in Iowa. We've seen several counties cite their comprehensive land use plan to, one, create restrictions on using specific types of land for solar development. And conversely, we have identified some counties that wrote renewable energy development into their comprehensive land use plan, such as Lynn County, Iowa, with an objective to encourage renewable energy development in their area. So including that in renewable energy development, including some language around agrivoltaics as a way of meeting those agricultural goals, can ensure that the economic benefits of development are taken into consideration when those ordinances are created. Another would be the siting and zoning regulations. So local decision makers can ensure that development is done in a way that meets their community by being proactive in their ordinance development process. So when you're already kind of dealing with a project proposal, it's difficult to engage in a thorough planning process with your community and ensure that the community input has all been received. So it's good to engage in a proactive process to develop your ordinances prior to development, but obviously if there's already a project in place, it's still a good time to discuss how that language is considered. The other thing would be zoning schemes. So zoning schemes that allow for a mixed land usage. This could include overlay districts or allowing development when certain land use standards are met. This could include requiring a certain percentage of land to be placed into the pollinator habitat or dual use, other types of dual use. And then siting regulations should be carefully thought about to ensure that they don't restrict dual use. For example, in a lot of ordinances, decision makers will include a specification about panel height, and it should be thought of, considered that an overly restrictive panel height could limit opportunities for grazing or crop co-location, those sort of things at the site. So making sure that those siting regulations are not overly prescriptive and limit the future use of agrivoltaics. Also, again, taking a look at definitions and ensuring that they do not preclude dual use. Could include the definition of solar generation, farmland, and farm to ensure that it's compatible with dual use. And then it's also important to determine what applications and practices will be considered dual use. For example, is pollinator habitat considered a dual use, or is it just crops and grazing? So making sure that the definition of dual use is outlined and what those practices actually look like. It's also important to think about how ordinances interact. So how do your goals interact? For example, pollinators and grazing. Those are two different goals that can exist happily together, but it should be carefully planned to make sure that a pollinator-friendly goal doesn't unintentionally limit grazing opportunities. And in that same vein, to meet pollinator requirements, we need to make sure that the grazing schedule allows all of the plants to bloom at the site so that those pollinator goals are actually met. So just careful planning in advance can allow multiple goals to happen at the same time. And then again, a reminder that setting overly strict guidance can deter development. It is wise to remember that 100% of the land at the site might not be suitable to be integrated into dual use. And so perhaps a percentage is more of a better requirement when thinking about requirements for dual use at a site. And then that also would allow for some flexibility at the site, but ensuring that the intent of the policy is still preserved. So I don't want it just to be kind of an idea, but something that ensures that original intent of agriculture being at the site is still preserved. And then lastly, it's also important to think a little bit, although this doesn't relate directly to dual use at sites, but I think it's a very important point, which is how does site construction, decommissioning, and restoration play in? So ordinances around construction and decommissioning of solar systems can minimize the land use impacts of development. And so while solar projects overall, done in a planful way, have a minimal impact on the overall land quality, and they allow land to be returned to farming at the end of the project's life if desired. It's important to really think about putting in some decommissioning, vegetation management plans, restoration plans in advance during the application, so that those expectations and obligations are very clear to everyone involved in the process, the developer, the local government, the landowner. Everyone is on the same page and understands how that land will be managed. And so these are just good ways to protect the land quality at the site. And so I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much for being here today. This was a very brief overview of our papers. And so if you're interested in the topics today, I would definitely encourage you to check out the papers. They are on the Agrisolar Clearinghouse website. They're much more in depth than we were able to offer today. But we're very happy that we were able to share, and thanks to my co-host and to Stacy for allowing us to speak today.
Thanks so much. Anna, did you want to moderate some questions from the chat for our speakers?
Sure thing, I can definitely do that. We had a few questions come through. Let me pull them up here. I had a couple requests for some state-specific details when Alexis was talking. Asked for information on Florida and then also the state of agrivoltaics in Oregon. And I know that may be a question to address in detail at a larger time. Is there anything that you guys could add about those two states at the moment?
I couldn't speak to the state of agrivoltaics in Florida, but I know that Oregon State University has been a longtime leader in agrivoltaic research. We have some innovative industry players joining the scene who are advancing livestock-based applications. So actually looking at cattle grazing in conjunction with solar. So not in terms of the policy landscape, I couldn't speak to it, but I know industry and research is really active in Oregon.
We will be having a webinar too very soon from our partners at Renewable Northwest that handle policy in Oregon. So stay tuned for that in about 3 weeks.
We also had someone asked if we're finding any developers that are leveraging REAP programs for utility scale solar.
Go ahead, Heidi.
So the REAP program is geared towards small businesses and agricultural producers, and they do require the projects to be small. I can't, off the top of my head, say exactly what megawatt that would be, but the definition is small within the program.
All right, someone also asked if a county has a fairly new ordinance in place that doesn't include agrivoltaics, is there a way that you would recommend go about like convincing or talking to the government to help change that ordinance to include agrisolar without slowing down the approval of projects that may already be in the pipeline?
I think it's important to remember that the way that the ordinance is written, if it doesn't explicitly disallow agrisolar, it doesn't mean that that would not be able to be a project that could happen. So just because dual use or agrisolar is not written very explicitly into the ordinance does not necessarily mean that it's disallowed in the site. So it's just careful reading of the way that the ordinance is written. And if it becomes a problem, if it becomes obvious that this is, within the ordinance, it needs to be changed, perhaps clarifying that in the future would be something, but it's definitely not automatically something that couldn't happen. It might be just fine within the way that the current ordinance is written, with no mention at all of dual use or agrivoltaics.
And someone also asked, how do you all see a smart way to help farmers understand managing the conservation reserve program and agrivoltaics choices, especially with pollinators or carbon storage only arrays?
That's a good question. I'm not going to pretend I can answer it really intelligently or effectively, but first thing that comes to mind when thinking about helping farmers manage choices, I think about agriculture extension offices and creating technical assistance capacity there. So when I know there's resources out there for solar leasing for farmers, AFT actually has a really great guide that's focused in the Northwest US. So there's resources out there to help farmers make choices about solar land leasing. And I'd like to see more capacity at university extension offices to help manage that decision-making process. That's really high level and not direct, but I think that's the direction we need to go.
We've also got any thoughts on the incentives versus requirements approaches to policy and which results in more megawatts of AV being built, and ideally at a fast speed?
Yeah, I'll jump on that and say, based on my research experience, so I've been interviewing developers for 3-4 years now about understanding key motivations and barriers to their adoption of agrivoltaics. So naturally, we respond to incentive more than we do to punishment. So I think that the carrot approach, definitely powerful, but there needs to be some structure and some standard within that approach. So it's a little give and take, a lot of standard within the approach, but there needs to be some sort of way to reconcile perceived high costs, perceived complexities that the solar energy faces when they enter the agrivoltaic market. So I know there's issues when we talk about implementing a tariff and what's the impact on ratepayers, but there's also awesome other ways to do it. Like we see in the chat here, a new tax credit for agrivoltaics. There's different ways to go about it that don't have broader implications. So high level, yes, incentives, good. We need standards when implementing those incentives.
All right, we've got quite a few people popping in the chat now, so if I miss you, I'm sorry. I'm just going to grab a few that I can see here. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Somebody asked, for a state where sheep is not a huge industry or economically viable for most farmers, how do we shift the agrivoltaics conversation away from only sheep in terms of dual use opportunities?
So for that one, I feel like people just need to know that it is possible to add larger animals. We recently brought cows out to Jack's Solar Garden. Ours are 8 feet off the ground, and the cows just were much more interested in the grass and than they were in anything to do with the solar. They enjoyed the shade, but I think that we just need to have some more pilot projects where we see these larger animals. I know there's a project in Massachusetts that's also incorporating cattle. 25% of our land use in the United States is cattle rangeland. So we really just need to push people to find ways to make it work. This is an engineering problem that I think is entirely solvable. But yeah, it just needs to be piloted and showcased and show that it can be done.
Someone asked if you all have recommendations for any specific agrivoltaics research gaps to be filled.
I think looking at other states, like we're doing Colorado, we have Illinois, but I think that looking at that local level policy in more states and all the states, if possible, would be a really great research project for people to start looking at.
Yeah, I agree. This is such a new area. And so, as we mentioned, when we're looking at these policies, they're really just kind of developing. A lot of them are even in pilot program stage. And so certainly I think within the policy realm, there's a lot of research opportunities in regard to agrivoltaics in general. I'm not sure, maybe Stacy can speak to it. I know she's talking to lots and lots of research partners within the clearinghouse.
Sure. I think for research gaps in general, I mean, I think the different types of agrivoltaics, I think that we're needing to see more work in crops. I think we're needing to see that around the country. I think that we've got some great data with solar grazing, and I think we've got some great data with solar pollinator habitat. So I think the biggest gap is within the co-location of solar and crops and perhaps solar and beekeeping. But I think that we're going to see more and more of that, especially with like the Climate Smart Ag Awards down with the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. We're hoping to do 10 to 12 different agrivoltaic research demonstration sites. So I think all of the great research that's going on right now, we haven't really seen a lot of the results yet, and we're about to. So we will be seeing the work of Scapes. We'll be seeing the great work that they're doing with University of Arizona, all the great work that Inspire is doing. And there's a lot of new information coming out. So I'm excited to see what it is. And I think we're about to learn a whole lot more about agrivoltaics.
I also have a question from someone wanting to know who are the types of people that are performing the actual farming on these new AV sites? Are they more like existing legacy farmers, or are we seeing like immigrants and new farmers coming to this?
I can jump in from the Agrisolar Clearinghouse perspective. We're seeing that all across the board. There's some great groups like Big River Farms that are they're working with immigrant programs, and the folks at US Solar have a great program for that up in Minnesota. We're also seeing a lot of research in this. So sometimes it's like a state land grant university that's doing this. We're seeing a lot of grazers that are moving in this space. And then we're seeing folks that want this on their farm. So NCAT's got a strong history of working with farmers and being a farmer first organization. So that's a lot of what we're seeing, but we do get a lot of calls from solar developers as well, and community planners that are interested in this. And that's where these resources are just going to be great for those type of folks that these ladies have produced here.
I think I hit the questions. If I missed somebody, feel free to drop it again so it pops down to the bottom so I can see it. But I think that covers all of our questions in the chat. Okay, well, thank you all so much for being here, and thank you for your great work on this webinar and on these publications. They are all going to be available. They're available right now within the Agrisolar Clearinghouse, and this webinar recording will be up within 1 to 2 weeks once we get it formatted and ready to go. So thank you all for joining us.